Alright, welcome back guys. So in this video, we're now going to go over what I call the drop-off problem, which like I said in the last video, is basically, it's basically the problem related to why we're not able to use a lot of the techniques we've been discussing for charging emotion, why we're not able to use them to charge the subconscious for the purpose of performance, right? So, and I didn't really make notes, as you can see. I figured I was going to, but I figured I'll just kind of talk from the top of my head for this issue. So basically, when I first learned, when I was first developing these ideas and learning how to charge my subconscious and learning how to control it, I was mainly doing it for the purpose of emotions, right? Now, I actually first learned all these stuff. I think I might have said it already, but I first learned the idea of the subconscious as I know it now when I was much younger, and I learned it in the context of transcendental performance. But then when I started studying it more in depth, I mainly was studying how to charge emotions. So I was practicing to charge emotions. But I still knew that transcendental performance, or being in the zone, came from my subconscious mind. Now, I was able to, I was pretty good. Well, compared to the way I am now, I probably wasn't that good. But at that time, I didn't really find it that hard to charge the subconscious for emotions, right? But it was pretty hard for me, right, to charge the subconscious for performance. So even at that time, I kind of understood that I wasn't really that good at that, right? So, but I knew that entering the zone or charging for performance was a property of the subconscious mind, or it involved control of the subconscious, right? So, and I never really knew why that was, like why it was so hard for me to charge for performance. But I always felt like I could do it, but I always felt like I wasn't doing it very efficiently, right? So I felt like I was giving a lot of wasted effort, right? And so eventually I started studying entering the zone and studying charging the subconscious for that purpose. And I kept trying to figure it out, basically. So now over the years, so I'll basically come up with this idea that I basically wanted to test out as a solution or a way of trying to charge for the purpose of performance. But what I'll just say first is that over the years, even before I started really studying the subconscious, right, I always kind of studied the mind, and I got into trying to learn how to basically entertain people or be a conversationalist. It's basically, and I said in the book in the beginning of in the introductory chapter, I always had trouble sort of interacting with others and socializing and things like that. But I was always really good at making theory, right? So I was doing, even when some of what I'm doing now with theory, I was always doing that, even when I was like a kid, with other things. And so eventually I got the bright idea, right, that I was going to try to make theory in terms of how to interact with others and be a good conversationalist and be more entertaining toward others. And it actually worked, and there were some ideas that I picked up on, some things that I learned. So one of the things I actually learned was that the key to really stimulating people and really entertaining them, right, or keeping them interested, basically, in the conversation, is to emotionally stimulate them, right? That's basically the language of entertainment, which we know now, right? So in terms of this theory, but I didn't have this theory back then. But I still picked up on a lot of the principles. And I also understood that you couldn't just control that type of thing within another person and even within yourself at will, right? So that falls what we talked about in terms of transcendental mental abilities. They have a property of timing, right? So, and I recognized that even back then. I knew that, there's nothing I can do to forcefully control at will when a person is emotionally stimulated by something I said. But I would always know when I successfully managed to achieve it based on their bodily response, right? So whenever I would say something, if they bust out laughing or I just see their eyes light up and they kind of become interested, I'd be like, yes, right? So my goal was achieved. And I would keep sort of gauging their interest to figure out when I've emotionally stimulated them. In fact, I would even say now, right, what I used to do is actually, in terms of this theory, I didn't think of this back then, but when we talked about in terms of subconscious volatility, right? So the more your attention goes to a particular subject which has a charge or has a lot of positive memory, the more volatile your subconscious will be toward that subject. So it'll try to the more it's going to try to enter a transcendental state. In a way, what I used to do is, when in conversation, I would focus on watch a person's bodily responses, and just in the conversation, I would try to gauge where their subconscious was super volatile. And whenever I landed on a topic that their subconscious was very volatile towards, or they were very interested in, I would stay there, right? So they would stay charged up, right? So that's a way of explaining it in terms of this theory. Like I said, I didn't think of it that way back then, but that was something I used to do. It's basically a technique I would do. But yeah, so doing that, basically getting back to the story, so doing that, I eventually learned that that the frequency or the emotion I wanted to stimulate in others, I generally had to feel myself. So very rarely did I feel, like, let's say, emotion A, and then stimulate a person to feel emotion B, right? They were usually a match. They were the same emotion. So I got in the habit of trying to feel the emotion that I wanted other people to feel, because I was always trying to figure out which emotion I wanted to sort of emotionally stimulate them into as I was holding a conversation or entertaining them. That was basically my strategy, to pick the emotion, right? And so eventually, going back to this, I got the bright idea that if I charge an emotion, basically based on that principle, if I charge an emotion to very intense levels, I had the bright idea that that should, in theory, lead me to a transcendental performance, or should allow me to stimulate that emotion in others very strongly, right? So even though I had trouble using the technique for charging emotion to enter the zone, I basically thought maybe that principle would help me, right? So that as long as I can charge an emotion very intensely, and if feeling that emotion is going to help me stimulate that emotion in others, presumably higher intensity of that emotion allows me to stimulate that emotion in others more strongly, or I'll have a higher affinity for doing that. So that was basically my theory, and I tested it out. And the one that I tested it with, at least that I remember, one of the first times I did that, was with the emotion of humor. Now, the humor frequency and the laughter frequency are slightly different. I didn't know that at the time, so I just charged the emotion of humor. And I basically did it the same basic way. I would focus on certain ideas or stories in my mind, and just use that to try to feel the emotion of humor more and more and more intensely. So at that time, I did have a understanding of that I had to enter a transcendental state to charge. I didn't quite call it that. I didn't quite know the properties of transcendental states that well, but I have a vague idea of it. I had the very basic idea that I needed to do that to charge. And so I did that, right? And I remember doing that, and then I did it basically with the hopes that now I could start talking to people and crack all these jokes and sort of be entertaining a conversation along the humor frequency. So I basically can make them laugh. And that's definitely not what happened, right? So I actually noticed that when I would charge in that way, and then I had a good charge going, and then start trying to interact with people, I noticed it was actually harder to interact with them, right? It wasn't easier, and I definitely didn't feel a strong affinity for cracking jokes. And so I basically understand now why that happened, right? Because my subconscious, by focusing on the subject in my mind, right, my subconscious charged in a way where if I have to maintain that emotion, I have to stay focused on the subject in my mind, right? And so it was actually, I noticed, and my subconscious compels me to focus on that subject and not on other things. So when I would focus on other people, it was actually harder to interact with them, because I would keep wanting to go back to sort of tuning them out and just focusing on what was going on in my mind. And the same thing would actually happen. Actually, before I even go into that, what I actually noticed was that when I did interact with others, so when I would charge all that emotion and feel that emotional intensity, right, when I would interact with others, I would notice that emotion just drop off, right, which is where this term comes from. Like, I would feel it like crazy, and then as soon as I focus on other people and interact with them and start talking with them, the emotion would just go away. And it actually go away pretty fast, right? So it wouldn't go linearly like that. It would do like that very steeply, and then I wouldn't feel any emotion anymore. So it kind of cut into my theory on the idea that I usually have to feel the emotion I want to stimulate in others. If it drops off, then there's really no way for me to do that. At the very least, it's not going to help that much from that principle of charging the emotion. And so the same thing happened I noticed, and some people have probably experienced this, when I would charge the emotion of confidence, right? So I would focus on some circumstance, right? I would charge the emotion of confidence, and then when I would get into that circumstance in real life, the confidence would just drop off. So as an example, when I was in, so I have a problem with public speaking, right? I'm terrible at that, right? Almost basically it's like a phobia. And so when I was in college, I had to give this speech in front of the class, right? And I knew that was a problem of mine, but I kept trying to psych myself out, saying, okay, it's not a big deal, it'll be all right. And so I actually kept doing that, and I started to actually feel relatively confident. Not a huge amount, but I started to feel it decently. So I thought maybe it would be okay. And I felt the emotion of confidence too. And so when I got into that situation, right, when I had to go in front of the class and give my speech, right, as soon as I started giving the speech and just started looking at everybody in the class, then a feeling of a confidence just dropped off immediately, right? So very steeply, it was just gone. It was out of there, right? And so then all that anxiety started coming in, right? Almost right away, right? But I did feel a certain amount of confidence going into it, right? And so, in other words, that confidence dropped off, right? And that's was something I always noticed, right, when I would try to do this, when I was trying to apply that theory of charging more emotion and having that emotion or using that emotion to stimulate emotions in others. Whenever I would charge it and then focus on other people and interact with others or get into some particular activity, the emotion would just drop off immediately, and I would have trouble sort of stimulating that emotion in others. And so why is this problem, why is that dropping off problem, the problem of emotions sort of going like this and then doing like that the moment I start interacting with people, why is that an issue for transcendental performance? Well, the reason actually has to do with what we spoke about in chapter 3, right, regarding transcendental mental abilities. So he basically said that they had 3 main properties, right? So they have the property of timing, right, meaning that you can't use your transcendental mental abilities whenever you feel like. They also have the property of quantization, which is related to timing. They're quantized by intention and frequency. That determines how you'll be able to use your transcendental mental abilities. And they also have the property of energy, right? Now, what we also said, because when your subconscious is charged up, your subconscious instinct uses So when your subconscious is charged up, your subconscious instinct will use all transcendental mental abilities at once, right? And one of those transcendental mental abilities are emotions. So generally, we said that you're going to usually feel some emotion relatively strongly anytime you perform a transcendental mental ability. And so that also extends into transcendental performance. So if you're going to perform at a transcendental level, which presumably means you're using your transcendental mental abilities, you're usually going to feel some emotion relatively strongly. So if your emotion is constantly dropping off, right, the moment you try to engage in some activity and use transcendental performance, then that's going to be a problem, right? You need to feel your emotions relatively strongly in order to perform transcendentally, right? So whenever I would enter the zone, right, I usually felt some emotion relatively strongly. When I was first practicing this stuff, right, I would usually enter the zone in the along the frequencies of making jokes, or sometimes I would use a danger frequency, which is basically the coolness frequency, right? And so I would usually feel some emotion relatively strong, which I was aware of. Now, if the emotion drops off, then if my theory is correct, then I'm not going to be able to perform at a transcendental level. So this is an issue, right? So my battery actually died. Hopefully it stays on now. So like I was saying, I think I left off at the drop off of emotions are actually going to be a problem when it comes to transcendental performance, right? Basically, what I'll need to do is figure out how to charge an emotion, right, and then maintain that intensity or maintain the intensity of feeling that emotion while interacting with others, right? While focusing on the rest of the world and focusing on the environment around me and interacting with people and things like that. And that's not really something we've spoken about. That's not a technique that we basically learned how to do yet. So what I've been teaching you so far was basically just to focus on some subject or some story in your mind, put majority of your attention on that, right? Because that causes your subconscious to have a more powerful response and charge more powerfully, right? And then just pretty much stay within the confines of your own mind, right, when charging. So it's very easy to keep a lot of your attention on a single subject, right, while or single main subject or category while it's in your mind. But it's much harder to do that while you're focusing on the rest of the world around you. And actually, just to sort of get into it even more, based on his theory, charging works by making some subconscious memory more and more positive, right? And your subconscious memory is accessed by the subject that you focus on. Now, if you're just focusing on some story in your mind, it's very easy to sort of keep track of a single subject which carries the charge and make that subject more and more positive and give a whole bunch of your attention to that subject. When you're interacting in the rest of the world, of course, your attention will traverse or go over many different subjects. It's not going to stay on a single subject. And it's going to go to many different subjects that all have a subconscious memory that aren't carrying a charge, right? I'll be in new situations with different people and things like that, in new environments. So how do I sort of maintain the intensity of a charge, which requires me to focus on a subconscious memory or keep my attention on a subconscious memory? How do I maintain that focus while interacting with others in environments with focusing on many different subjects and environments that are pretty much going to be new much of the time? So that's actually what I call the drop-off problem, right? So that's if I'm going to learn how to charge the subconscious for transcendental performance, I'm going to have to figure out a way to solve that problem, right? And I don't know if I mentioned it before, when subconscious memory is in a passive state, so in terms of and affects my mood, that actually will lead to a relative increase in my performance, but not that much, right? My subconscious memory has to be in an active state to really give me a strong level of performance. At least that's been my experience, right? So how do you keep a subconscious memory in an active state while focusing on many different subjects and interacting with many different people and environments and things like that? So that's basically the problem that we're going to have to solve if we're going to figure out how to charge the subconscious for transcendental performance, right? So, and that is something I did eventually figure out how to solve, which, although when I was first doing this, I didn't think of it in these terms, but it was still pretty much the same exact thing. I had to learn how to solve the certain problems to learn how to charge for the purpose of transcendental performance. So in a nutshell, this is really why you cannot use a lot of the techniques we spoke about before to charge transcendental performance. It just isn't going to work. The techniques we spoke about aren't going to transfer to these charging conditions, right? They pretty much only work if you can keep your attention in your mind, focus on a single subject, put a huge amount of your attention on that subject, right? And then just tell a story while charging. Tell a story to quantize your subconscious so it charges up. Right? It's very easy to focus on a single subject or category if you're tuning out the rest of the world. But it's a whole other animal when you're interacting with the rest of the world and focusing on many different things. So the key to solving this problem, we're actually in the next couple of videos, we're basically going to talk about, we're going to build up certain ideas until eventually we're able to figure out the solution to solving this problem. And like I said before, the solution is a new formalism that we're going to talk about that I call path formalism. Right? We're going to talk about path charging, right? Which is something new, something different, right? But yeah, that's pretty much it. So that's the drop-off problem. And just to repeat it in a nutshell, the key to performing at a transcendental level requires you to feel some emotion relatively strongly. To do that, you'll have to keep some subconscious memory in an active state, which has a positive charge. And when you focus on the environment around you, your focus usually switches right away from that main subject that's carrying a charge right away, right? And so the emotion just drops off, right? Because you took your subject off the subject that carries the charge. And so yeah, and that will prevent you from performing a transcendental level. So yeah, that's pretty much it. We're gonna solve that problem we're going to talk about transcendental performance by solving this problem, by focusing on the solution to this problem. Right, so that's it for now, but thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.